In the last podcast, I set out an academic and in some ways political agenda to frame how we should explore the use of technologies, emphasising two principles. The first was that any discussion should recognise that technologies have always been a part of the teaching and learning process, that the computer extends historical uses of the pen, the OHT, the textbook, and so on. The second key principle was that we should avoid the allure of what we can do with various gadgets, in favour of their deep pedagogical implications, how they actually mediate knowledge and understanding and the process of learning. In this podcast, I'm going to mobilise these two principles in analysis on two levels. Firstly, offering a theoretical model through which we might start to appreciate the deeply integrated way which technologies interact with learning. In the second segment, I'll think more broadly about the ways in which technologies throughout history have shaped the production, distribution and consumption of knowledge and understanding, and how this, in turn, has influenced the curriculum. So let's begin by looking at two fairly mundane pictures of children engaged in activity using technology. The first, a traditional blackboard, and the second, an interactive version. On one level, the processes here are the same. They involve the performance of understanding, demonstrated through a tactile medium. In both, answers can be trialled in a non-permanent way, enabling testing and probing of answers and the thought processes that produce them. The depth by which technology can talk back is, of course, different. The interactive whiteboard can react in a way that the blackboard doesn't. Here, the teacher must provide the feedback loop in the process. There are also differences in the appeal of the two technologies. The visual and auditory appeal of the electronic resource and its relative newness may well motivate learners to engage more closely with it. This shouldn't be ignored, though I'd also suggest that it can be overstated. Newness is only ever temporary, and I'd argue that whilst motivation establishes an important prerequisite for learning, it doesn't guarantee the dynamic of that learning itself. So we've some emerging sense here of the pedagogic implications of technology, but I think we can dig deeper. And I found the work of Edwin Hutchins to be particularly useful in this respect. Hutchins' involvement in learning theory is interesting, in that he originates from a background in anthropology, in contrast to the usual psychological domination of the field. As such, he breaks from the insulated model of learning, which situates all of the processes within the brain of the individual. Rather, he suggests that learning is a situated exercise, a process that is not contained inside the individual, but in the interactions between that individual and the context they inhabit. This can be quite a difficult concept to get your head around, partly because the notion that learning is an internal process is so culturally resonant. I find it easy to summarise Hutchins' position as this: we think using things. One of those things is language, sets of prefabricated meanings which are external to us, but which we can draw upon as tools through which to make sense of our world. Technologies are, in Hutchins' stance, similar. In using them, we extend our cognition using an artefact external to us. This is an interesting and potentially provocative stance, and one which begs a re-evaluation of how we consider technology in pedagogy. The usual conceptualisation is to consider it as an adjunct to thinking, something separate to the processes within the brains of individuals, or even as an interference to cognition, the notion that in using a technology we erode the internal capacity that might otherwise perform that particular operation. The furore that surrounds the use of calculators is in many ways emblematic of these tendencies. But Hutchins' call is for something a bit different. He suggests that technologies are not adjuncts or interferences to cognition, that they are inseparable from cognition. To talk of thinking separate from technologies, and here I include language, is meaningless. Gabriel Solomon has developed these principles, and offers illustration with resonance to the examples with which we begun this exploration. He evokes the simple example of two children solving a maths puzzle together on a scrap of paper. Here, the paper is the technology, and it is the part of the learning process and of the children's cognitions. It performs two functions. On one hand, it enables social cognition for the children to think together in a way that would otherwise not be possible. On the other, the paper is a medium through which some of the cognitive processes involved can be offset or offloaded. In writing something down, we're able to externalise and concretise it, and thus render it more malleable. This is most apparent in things like the processes involved in a maths equation, in which the breaking down into a series of steps on paper allows us to keep track of running totals and interactions in a more manageable way. I would argue, though, that the distance and containedness of writing offers this same quality to a whole range of forms of cognition. So then, Hutchins and Solomon offer one interesting mechanism through which to unpack some of the sophistication by which technologies interact with the learning process. And I think that their mode of thinking can profitably be applied from established technologies right the way through to newer innovations. I'm left wondering, for instance, about the possibilities of social cognition offered by the internet. In the next segment of this podcast, I'm going to broaden out a little, from the relationships of technologies in the learning process to their influence on knowledge itself. Here, I'll suggest that technologies are not just used to produce knowledge, in the sense, for instance, that they're scientific apparatus, but also that they have been pivotal in containing and distributing that knowledge. In doing so, I'm going to suggest that the dominant technology which contains knowledge also mediates its nature, the degree of access to it, and the qualities by which we consume and interact with it. In doing so, I'll be following a tradition established in the 1960s by Marshall McLuhan, one of the earliest media theorists, and the pithy notion that the medium is the message. An early part of McLuhan's work related to the social ramifications of the printing press, perhaps one of the most significant inventions of all time. The press had obvious implications for knowledge. It made understanding more distributable, and thus more accessible. Books were cheaper than their hand-scribed precursors, and thus the printing press heralded a massive democratisation of access to knowledge and understanding. McLuhan, though, was more interested in the ways in which the new medium of the book shaped the qualities of knowledge, and how individuals interacted with it. He notes, for instance, that the literary revolution established a deep-rooted graphocentrism in culture, the notion that the word contains a more valid form of truth than other modes of expression. Of course, in previously less literate times, the illustration and decoration of text was as important as the written content. The linear nature of the book also established the importance of lines of argument and logics, an important precursor to the modernist turn in the Renaissance. Elsewhere, Eisenstein has suggested that the printing press and the fixed nature of the word in books produced a set of orthodoxies and paradigms specific to fields, but also the possibility of fringe understandings, defining heterodoxies and countercultures outside of them. This is not just specific to the content of domains of knowledge, but also the divisions between domains themselves. That a particular body of understanding is distinct from another, ethics from science for instance, is as much a product of historical accident and their delineation in the genre of text as it is their internal logics. This notion has also been developed by McLuhan in one of the most striking quotes from his book The Gutenberg Galaxy. Here he suggests that print has fostered a compartmentalised and linear outlook and construct of knowledge, one reinforced not just by the genre of text and the fields within these genres, but by the need to present a linear treatment, segmented into chapters and subchapters. In turn, this observation makes me think about how the textbook, one of the most overwhelmingly influential technologies of secondary education in particular, has shaped educational provision and practice. The curriculum has evolved, I would argue, in reference to those resources which people have always learnt from, and as such, the logics of print inhabit it too. In short, we have a curriculum which, like a book, is segmented and compartmentalised, and fundamentally linear. So given all of this, we're left with a question. How significant are new technologies? For me, it's easy to be flippant in the answer to this, but I want to resist this urge. Historical technologies have also been significant. Here, we've exposed some of the really complicated processes surrounding seemingly mundane things like a pen and paper and a textbook. I think considering new technologies as an extension of this history is productive. Equally though, information technologies, like those that have gone before, shape knowledge and learning in different ways, and we shouldn't ignore this. The internet, for instance, resists the compartmentalising of knowledge in discrete and fixed ways, and abhors linearity. It thrives instead on interconnection. It extends the democratic access to knowledge and understanding, but also the production of that knowledge, eroding some of the elitist nature by which truth is established. As with any technology, the implications of these facets is both positive and negative, and in this session, I'd like to grapple with those complexities.